Hello and welcome to week 4. This week we're going to be examining sediments and sedimentary rocks. So let's dive into some slides now. Okay, so yes, right here on the right-hand side, we are looking at some sediment. And what I want you to be clear about is sediment is the loose unconsolidated material. And once it's been buried, hardened, or lithified, that makes sedimentary rocks. Now, you will see a lot of features formed of sediment every day, most likely. We live in Minnesota. Most of the land surface underneath the soil has sediment. It's either sediment that was left by the glaciers or it's sediment that was deposited by streams. And then in southeastern Minnesota, in particular, we have a sedimentary rock sequence. Many of the older rocks in northern Minnesota are also sedimentary in origin, but many of them have been metamorphosed. So we've got a summary on the left here of what we're going to be doing as we work through our lecture today. So let's move on. First of all, I want you to remember exactly where we are in the rock cycle. Last week, we looked at igneous rock. And the next step, if we're following the cycle round, is those processes associated with uplift, weathering, erosion, transport, and deposition. They've just got 3 of those here. They've missed out the uplift and the weathering, erosion, uplift and erosion. And what I want you to remember is the sediment can come from igneous rock. It can also come from metamorphic rock. Remember, that's one of those shortcuts. And it can be recycled from existing sedimentary rock. So there's 3 sources for sediment. And there's a few other things that are somewhat complex. But first of all, let's just be clear about exactly what sediment is. So focus over on the left. Sediment is loose, unconsolidated particles. And they result from weathering, and it should say, and erosion of pre-existing rock, in which case the sediment is called detrital sediment or clastic sediment. Yes, geologists have a whole bunch of terminology. Sediment can also be derived from precipitation from solution. So if you have salty water, for example, and that dries up, we get chemical sediments. So over here on the right, we've got an example of a salt flat that produces chemical sediments. When that briny water dries up, there will be halite. Remember the mineral halite? That will crystallize. And there are a bunch of other chemical sediments that form. Up on the top here, however, we've got our detrital sediments. So that is sediment that is made up of the loose particles. And you can see here, some of these sediments are actually from the North Shore on Lake Superior. I took this picture at the Duluth waterfront. So there's a wide variety of sediment right there. So we can see there's a variation. Now, there's also, in addition to the detrital sediments and chemical sediments, there's also organic sediment. And so if you just imagine organic muck of some kind, that produces organic sediment. The closest thing to that you may be familiar with is if there's squelchy stuff on a lake floor, just all that organic material, dead leaves, stuff that fall down there, and it's really icky. So how do we get to having sediment? So remember that UWETD. We've dealt with uplift, whatever rocks are sourcing the sediment are at the surface, but now they will typically get weathered. And weathering is actually kind of complex. There's two types of weathering. There's physical, or it sometimes gets called mechanical weathering. And that's the physical breakdown of rock material. The way I often describe this is I will take a single piece of paper and I'll say, okay, that's just like tearing the paper into several pieces. And one of the classic ways of physical weathering happens in Minnesota is through ice wedging. So liquid water gets into cracks, it expands, and it breaks up the rock. This is how our potholes form. On the other hand, there's chemical weathering. And this can be described as decomposition of rocks by surface processes that change the chemical composition of the original material. Okay, that's a definition. But just look over here at this rock. What we're looking at around the edge is what we call a weathering rind. There's also a weathering rind, this orange layer around the rock on the left here. And what happens is those are the outside layers of the rock, and they have reacted with what is around them, and that is usually water that is warmer in temperature, and that's because water facilitates chemical reactions, and when it's warmer, that also facilitates chemical reactions. And the water has just reacted with the outside of the rock to produce a weathering rind. So many rock samples that you'll see have these weathering rinds, and they're a consequence of chemical weathering. If we think back to that little sort of demo I did with tearing a piece of paper up, I would describe chemical weathering as taking a piece of pink paper and then changing it with some blue paper, because we haven't physically broken the rock into bits, we're just changing it chemically. So we see quite a bit of evidence for chemical weathering and physical weathering in Minnesota. And I'm going to focus on rocks called core stones. And one can see core stones if one's driving on 23 southwest of St. Cloud. I want you to focus on the image in the center here. So this shows what is being called bedrock. In the case of the Minnesota core stones, this is typically granite. Now, that granite is actually cut by a whole bunch of cracks or fractures. Those are called joints. And what has happened since those rocks were exposed at the surface is that the warm temperatures they experienced when they were at the surface meant that not only did those cracks get opened up by water, but there was a lot of chemical alteration, chemical weathering. Now, if that chemical weathering completely breaks down the rock, we call it, the material that's produced is called saprolite, and that's deeply chemically weathered rock. There's another word that gets used for it in many other places, particularly if it's sandy, that is grus, granite grus. But let's get back to the core stones. So what happens is there are areas where there are these sort of spherical remnants of granite that are surrounded by saprolite. And if you look up here, you can get a sense of what some of those core stones might look like. If you're driving along 23, you see these rounded boulders. There's some in a sort of wetland area off to the, I think it's the southeast of the road. So that is an example of weathering in Minnesota. Now, once we've weathered the rock, and that all happens right in place, it has to be first removed from its starting place, and that requires an agent of erosion. And so those agents of erosion would be water, ice, or wind. Those agents will ultimately then transport the material and then deposit the material. But what can happen is this isn't a simple single process. You can have ice moving large blocks of rock first, and then when that ice melts, water might move the sediment. Then if the water dries up, or there's some really strong winds along a river valley, we might have wind moving the sediment. So this ends up being a really complex process. And what we're looking at here is an image. This one, I believe, is from Alaska. We're looking at a river system. We've got a river here that's transporting some sediment, but you can see a lot of sediment that has been deposited. And it is carrying it out to the ocean. And you can see sediment plumes in the water here, where the sediment that those various channels are carrying is transferred into the water. So we have dealt with erosion, transport, and now we're thinking more about deposition of sediment. So this is so exciting. There are a whole bunch of different depositional environments. And before we investigate this diagram, I am going to mention some of them are exposed to air. The goofy word that we use for that is subaerial. If they are underwater, and when we say underwater, we mean somewhere in the ocean. We don't mean under the water in a stream. We say subaqueous. They can also be called marine environments for subaqueous environments, or continental environments for subaerial environments. Now, the amazing thing about all the different environments that sediments can be deposited in or sort of cycle through is that because the processes in these different environments are slightly different, that will give the sediment that's been deposited a hallmark, or there'll be a record that we can kind of pick apart to try and figure out what kind of environment it was deposited in. So here at the base of the slope, we've got a talus slope. That's all the material that's fallen down the steep slope. There's river channels, there's floodplains, there's alluvial fans. That's where streams exit the mountains, and the streams that are carrying a lot of sediment suddenly drop their sediment in a fan-shaped deposit. There's ice. Here they've got mountain glaciers. In Minnesota, we are dealing with ice lobes, the consequence of continental glaciation. So that's ice moving across relatively flat land that isn't restricted by landforms. And now let's think there's all these interesting transitional environments. Oh, there's a lake, there's deltas, lagoons, there's these offshore islands that get called barrier islands, then out into the ocean. Oh, my goodness, there's submarine canyons. Oh, back here we've got sand dunes, beaches, oh, reefs, and then this sort of shallow area, the shelf, and then it gets steeper going out into the ocean, the slope, and then the deep sea floor. So all sorts of environments to deposit sediment in. And here we've got just a few images to help you focus in. Oh my goodness, these are very different looking environments: lakes, rivers and streams, beaches and glaciers. And if we look at sediment that has been lithified, in other words, sedimentary rock, we can look at the detailed features to try and figure out what environment the sediment was deposited in. And this is one thing that gets used to understand past climates. So how do we name sediments? Well, the primary way we name sediments is through the use of particle size terms. So if you just look over here to this table, we use the diameter of the grains. And there is a systematic increase here for the diameter of the grains. And the words that get tied to this are clay, silt, sand, pebble, cobble, and boulder. So the 256 millimeters or 25 centimeter diameter is the smallest possible size for boulder. Pebbles and cobbles range from 2 millimeters to 6 millimeters. And then you go down to silt and clay. One thing I want to point out is that the word clay is used in several ways in geology. And in this case, we aren't thinking about modeling clay at all. We're using the word clay for lots of tiny particles. And you'll remember when we were talking about minerals, there are clay minerals. And that's because there are certain minerals that are typically the minerals that will end up making up these very fine particles. Now, getting back to modeling clay, yes, or potter's clay, that clay is basically derived from these very fine-grained particles. But just want you to wrap your head around those terms. Now, as well as the particle size, we also use things like the rounding of the particles and their organization. And this generally gets lumped into a word we call sorting. Before we move on, I just want to point out that sediment made up of pebbles, cobbles, and boulders is often lumped into gravel. Sand is sand. The word sand just refers to particle size. It has nothing to do with what the particles are made up of. Silt and clay are often grouped together in the word mud. So we'll be coming back to sedimentary rocks in a moment. And I've just put this in. It is what sedimentologists, that's the people that study sediments, use for classifying sediments. And there's a bit more detail in here. There's lots of different scales. The millimeter one highlighted by the red arrow is the one that you need to pay attention to if you're trying to name a sediment. Now, as well as particle size, we have to consider the composition of the particles. And this is where, as you imagine, it can get complicated. But there's really three main divisions. First of all, we have our detrital or clastic sedimentary rocks. And those are sedimentary rocks, or sediments for that matter, What you're looking at here is a sedimentary rock that are made up of rock fragments or individual minerals that have been broken out of rock fragments. And that happens as the material's being transported. Then there's our chemical sediment, and that's when we have a mineral growing. And this gets a little bit more interesting. Chemical sediment can either be pure chemical sediment, like the salt flats we talked about, the halite that might form there, or it could be formed by an organism making its shell, in which case we call it biochemical sediment. And then, as I mentioned before, we can have organic sediment. That's plant remains. So over here on the right, we're looking at a seam of coal that's made up of compressed organic matter. So that's an organic sedimentary rock. Here we're looking at a limestone. It is a chemical sedimentary rock. So I mentioned other ways or other terms we use to describe sediment. One gets lumped into grain morphology. That just means the shape of the grain and the organization of the grains. So first of all, there's sorting. If you've got a bunch of sediment, we call it well sorted if the particles are nearly all pretty much the same size. If there's a slight range, it'll be moderately sorted. But if there's tiny particles and larger particles, then that's poorly sorted. Then there's something we call sphericity and rounding angularity. And these are actually two separate things. Sphericity is regardless of how angular something is, it's about how close it is to being a sphere. So all these particles in the top row here are more spherical than the particles lower down. So that's sphericity. And then there's this rounding angularity scale. So as you move from the right over to the left, the particles change from being well rounded to having slightly more angular edges, going to sub-rounded, sub-angular to angular. So these are all things you can either see with the naked eye or with a magnifier, usually. Or if you've got an ordinary microscope in the class, you can do this. So just a reminder here, sediment isn't sedimentary rock. And if we start thinking about the naming of sedimentary rock, it essentially builds on the terms that get used for sediment. Except there are some additional things that happen. We might add some words to tell about the composition, sorting, rounding, angularity, and sedimentary structures. But the basic subdivision is if we have gravel, in other words, pebbles, cobbles, or boulders that have been lithified, if they are angular, we call them a breccia. That's how this is pronounced, and that's got nothing to do with my accent. Everyone calls it a breccia. On the other hand, if those particles are rounded, we call the rock a conglomerate. If we had sand-sized particles, we call the rock that's produced a sandstone. And then if we have silt and clay-sized particles, this is where people get kind of sloppy. Generally, if that sedimentary rock is mostly made up of silt, it gets called a siltstone. And if it's mostly made up of clay-sized particles, it will get called a shale or a mudstone. So that's our sedimentary rocks now. And those pesky chemical sedimentary rocks. What's really important here is limestone forms from the mineral calcite. And the mineral calcite gets precipitated by organisms making their shells. Those organisms die, their shells break up into smaller or larger pieces, and effectively that makes a limestone. There are also chemical sedimentary rocks that are not biochemical. Some cherts are, some cherts are not. But the short story is chert is made up of silica. And then there's a whole group of chemical sedimentary rocks that we call evaporites. These would include rock salt, that's halite. You may remember that from minerals. And then there's another mineral, gypsum. And here this is calcium, sulfur, oxygen. So that's calcium sulfate. And gypsum is actually interesting because it also has some water in its chemical structure, shown here as 2H2O. So and that's just got to do with balancing out how everything is packed together. Think back to the mineral definitions. So, oh, now this is, I think, a really fun little fact. So we're thinking about some chemical sediment. And so I just talked about gypsum. Here is the formula for gypsum. So it's that calcium sulfate, and there's a little bit of water in its mineral structure. There is another mineral that is called anhydrite. It is calcium sulfate, but it doesn't have any of this water. Now, we're going to think about these two vessels now. One is gypsum and one is anhydrite. I want you to think about which of these would be used to store grains in an ancient Egyptian burial chamber in the pyramids. These grains were needed for the pharaoh's onward journey. What are you thinking? Well, they will use anhydrite, and that's because gypsum has some water in the mineral structure, and that would cause the grain to start going moldy. So, anhydrite. Now, here's just a little note. Alabaster is the common word that technically refers to anhydrite. That's the rock made out of the calcium sulfate. But people are awfully sloppy, and anhydrite often gets called gypsum. And there's another problem. There's people who are sloppy mineralogists who think that alabaster is actually a kind of calcite. So that's just a heads up, and that's a nice little story. So before we move on any further, I want you to register on the fact that sediment is not soil. Dirt is not a geology term, and the word or phrase black dirt really refers to soil, got nothing to do with sediment. And here we're looking at a road that is, in this case, has a whole bunch of sediment on it. And then once you get into the fields, there'll be some soil underneath everything that's growing there. So just heads up, soil, a simple definition of soil is it's a layer of weathered, unconsolidated earth materials that contain organic material and is capable of supporting plant growth. And there's a whole science of soil. We're looking at a soil profile here. What I want you to remember here is never use the word soil for sediment and never use the word dirt for soil. So that's end of my little thing there. Now, we've talked about sediment being deposited. So it gets deposited in layers. And then those layers of sediment become lithified and they become sedimentary rock. So what we've got over here on the right is what we call a stratigraphic column. And this is the way sedimentologists present sedimentary rocks, because sedimentary rocks are deposited, oldest at the bottom, youngest at the top. And I usually demonstrate that by just playing cards. You know, the first card to be dealt is at the bottom, and then you put a layer of cards, etc. So we know the oldest sedimentary layer is at the bottom, youngest is at the top. That's all I want you to worry about for now. And when we draw stratigraphic columns, we use a whole bunch of symbols for different rock types. And you can see the key here shows a bunch of different symbols. They accord to different rock types. And it gets quite, there's a few words you haven't looked at yet there. And once we start looking at a stratigraphic column, that's when we can start thinking about how has everything changed in this one place over time. And that's because this stratigraphic column will be for one location. Now, often what geologists actually do is they will piece together stratigraphic columns from multiple different places to make one that summarizes the entire sequence. This is a stratigraphic column that essentially summarizes the sedimentary sequence in western Wisconsin, southeastern Minnesota, going from the Mount Simon sandstone up to the Shakopee Formation. So that's stratigraphic columns. Now, there's something else we need to think about if we're considering sedimentary rocks. We've talked about them being deposited as layers. Technically, the words that get used for those layers are strata or beds. And over here on the right, you can see a whole bunch of strata or sedimentary beds. They form very distinct layers, and you can see changes in the composition. Those changes are reflected in whether we've got good cliff forming rocks or they're kind of gentle slopes. Now, if we dive in a little bit deeper and consider what is in one or two of those strata or beds, we start thinking about bedding features. Now, these are really important because they help us understand what the agents of transport and deposition were. And some of the features that we can look for to help us are cross-bedding, graded bedding, and mud cracks. So let's take a look now at some of these bedding features. Cross-bedding. So here our main bed boundaries are where my cursor is moving parallel to that red arrow. But within this one bed, you can see that the layers are angled down towards the right. This makes up what we call cross-bedding because our main layering is still horizontal, but within that we've got these layers that are at an angle. And that's telling us that the transporting agent was depositing this sediment in dune-like forms, leaving these angled layers. The next one I want us to think about is graded bedding. So we've got a pen for scale here, and graded bedding is when you see a systematic change in the grain size. So for here, down here, we've got larger particles, and you see as you go up here, they get smaller and smaller. That's an example of graded bedding. And we actually call this normal grading. That's the phrase we use for when it goes from coarse to fine, from the bottom to the top. And graded bedding is usually a result of special currents that carry sediment offshore out into the deep ocean. Those currents are called turbidity currents, but we also find it in some stream sediments. Whoops, what have I done? Oh, I thought we had some mud cracks. Well, we don't have mud cracks. What I want to do now is just move to the document camera for a moment, because what we've got here, just to remind you, these are all sediments. So they are quite distinctive. Here, these are some sediments from northern Minnesota. And here is some beach sediment from somewhere in Florida. And I'm not sure where the number 10 sediment is. But what I want you to notice is number 11 is much better sorted than number 10. Number 14 is kind of interesting because there's some very large pebbles, but then it's sandy. Okay, so thank you very much. I think we'll call it a day here and enjoy the next pieces of work. You have 3 sedimentary rocks, 20, 21, and 22. They are a limestone, a shale, and a sandstone. So figure out which they are. A lot of you have already figured out number 20 because for many of you it wasn't numbered. Okay, we'll see you. Bye.